Hello there, Eric back again, your learning futurist. Today let's talk about automation, and more specifically, the paradox of automation. We're using automated systems more and more, and it gets us into a little bit of trouble when we rely on them so much, like perhaps autopilot in an airplane. Well, these kinds of systems are coming to education more and more, and in this video I'm going to relate that concept of the paradox of automation to new systems coming out around education like virtual and augmented reality, and something I'm calling the budding botanist paradox. So in this video, the connection of automation and education in immersive technology. Coming right up. All right. So many of you that watch this channel or read my research probably know that I'm very much a proponent for the use of immersive technologies in education, augmented virtual reality. There's a lot of great things about it. There's a lot of good things going on with it. But I do have some concerns as well. And one of the main concerns, probably one of the less talked about issues related concerns, possible risks, is this idea of automation around this technology. The idea of automating the general process of human inquiry, curated information, highly curated information that's being curated for us more and more. And what does that mean in the learning process? And I'm going to try to relate this to the paradox of automation. And what this concept says is the more and more we automate systems, the more complicated they get and the more problems that arise when these systems go awry. It also says that the more and more that we automate systems, the human design of them, the input from humans, becomes less and less and becomes more and more important. So when an automated algorithm is made, perhaps a few programmers make it, but then it is replicated and automated for millions of people. So if there's a flaw in that algorithm, it affects people, and it could affect them again and again and again. And when they break, there are even fewer people that understand the systems, understand how they evolved or went through the process of training through new data, and it's harder to fix, and it's harder for us to adjust and live without these automated systems. Again, we need to go through a period of adjustment back, because these automated systems may have become a little bit of a crutch for us. We see this already with our phones, not knowing how to remember phone numbers and such like that, because we are automating the process of remembering simple bits of information like that as well. So we take that forward and we move it to educational processes. But we see this already in the example I put up front in this video in aviation and the autopilot. Air France Flight 477 was flying from Rio de Janeiro to Paris and crashed, and everybody was lost. And through an investigation, they found that the autopilot system, the intake of flight data was iced over and was giving misinformation, and the autopilot system shut down, and at the same time was showing the pilots in the cockpit a little bit of misinformation of their airspeed, etc. But they were relying on the autopilot system so much that they overcorrected, stalled the plane, and crashed. And through this investigation, the Federal Aviation Association administration actually put out a warning to airlines and pilots in general that we are starting to rely on autopilot a little bit too much, and we need to maybe do some extra hours in the simulator or start taking manual control of flights a little bit more often to avoid situations like this when the autopilot does fail us. Now, overall, the autopilot has probably saved much more lives than this incident here, but it is an example of what it does to humans in situations when we rely on autopilot and it perhaps doesn't work as well. So in this situation, perhaps the autopilot can be improved upon and we're starting to rely on them more and more. But as we start to rely on it more and more, we miss it when things go wrong. So how do we relate that back to education? Well, let's talk about the budding botanist paradox. And let's say you are a budding botanist, you want to learn botany, you're out walking in nature, and it's a nice, beautiful day, and you come upon a species of flower or plant, and you want to identify that. You want to know what species you're looking at. And you have to go through and ask yourself a bunch of questions that is usually in the process of normal human inquiry, right? Where are you? What's the climate like? Have I seen any changes in the blossomings or the timings of these things? How many petals are on this thing? What's the color of it? How many are there? There's a bunch of very simple questions that you go through to help you kind of identify and come upon the potential species of what that flower might be. But we're starting to automate these processes for botanists very well. Take the process of augmented reality. We take a snapshot of a flower. Your phone knows where you are in the world, your GPS, and the picture is uploaded to a server and was curated. That picture is then matched up or put through a database of millions of other photos and spits out you the answer you're looking for to a great degree of accuracy. So what does this do to the process from which you need to learn how to actually come to the knowing of how to identify these things without the aid of it, right? You're robbing yourself of all those little questions leading up to that process. But maybe not all bad. We have apps like this out already and they're in use all the time. And actually, we saw something like this being announced by Niantic, the makers of Pokemon Go, where they see this as a real use case of how augmented reality is going to be using the world around you, curating information to give you that very information of what species of flower you're looking at. All good or all bad, a little bit of both, right? If you're maybe studying something else, maybe you're studying the climate or some other kind of issue around in that area, and you just want to know the species of that flower because maybe it's new to that environment. You're not really looking to be a botanist. Getting from point A to point B in other modes of inquiry is quite useful, but we might be robbing ourselves of certain things that we need to go, the process from which we need to go through to actually train ourselves to ask questions. And then, of course, just like in the autopilot situation, if we become to rely on these systems a little bit too much, something's a little bit strange, a little bit off in the algorithm, the people that program the pictures, the different pictures get uploaded, we trust the answer a little bit too much, we could get into problems or issues, and we lose that ability to actually function or go through the process from which to learn what kind of species of flower that is. So, in a sense, the paradox of automation, but in a learning context. All right, so let's talk about how I'm kind of grappling upon and how the journey might be, from how we get from immersive technology, curating, over-curating, automating perhaps a little bit too much, through the evolution of how we're using technology in the basic process of human inquiry. So let's take, for example, 3 different steps. Now, the first step is using a Google search. Now, Google search, a very simple one, perhaps in the late 90s. All you would do is put in a simple string of text, very minimal amount of data, and you get a large amount of data in return. Google would send you back 10,000 to 50,000 hits that might relate to your simple text search. And that information is curated relatively low to the other steps we're going to talk about in here. So you put in a text search for shoes or how to do something, you're going to get probably the most common or most linked to sites that have that specific text in that website or in the metadata for that website. Of course, over time, this is getting much more complicated, much more automated. It's now, when you put in a string of text in Google, it's not just that string that it's looking for, it's an amalgam of your past searches and where you are and a bunch of other data that's now collected for you. But simply put, you're putting in a little bit of data It's not getting curated that much for you, and you're getting a lot of possible information in return. And so because you're getting a lot of information in return, you might have to ask a second question. You might need to rephrase or redo another search or two to learn a little bit more or find the specific information that you're looking for. And in that process, you learn some tangential information about the subject you're into. You might find some competing or opposing viewpoints or opinions about what you're looking for. Just that process of inquiry leads you to the opportunity for an unknown discovery. And so a bunch of other things happen in this situation that also build up those muscles of learning, of asking the better questions, of going after information and finding and criticizing where that information comes from in general. We take that a step further. In the smartphone era, we have voice assistants. Voice assistants take our voice information, the data around our voice. A recording is much higher amount of data than a string of text, and we're getting back one answer, and that answer is highly curated in comparison to what would happen before. So it takes where we are, what we've asked it before, and it has to be calibrated to our voice to understand us a little bit better. So it's training itself with our voice to understand us a little bit better. So a large amount of data is being taken in, and we're getting one answer, one definitive answer. And we might like that answer, we might not like that answer. And so in many situations, we either trust that answer, we like that answer, or we have to go back to the text search and ask the better question. So this is what I mean by is it all good, is it all bad? But in educational context, we need to be able to go back a step and re-ask the questions and do a different mode of search in order to keep our inquiry muscles strong, if that's making sense. So let's take that a step further into the future and go to the phone on the face era that I talk about a lot on this channel, when we start to curate information through visual processes, perhaps with a set of glasses or through pass-through VR headset or whatever. So now we are taking in the maximum amount of input, where we're looking, what we're looking at, our eye movement, our head movement, our voice. There's a ton of data, a ton of bandwidth that's going out, and we are getting also back a large amount of data from that, but it's also very highly curated. So in this situation, wherever we go, wherever we move, whatever we look at is constantly being taken in, analyzed, and so all up until that point, even before we ask the question, an algorithm might predict that we are going to ask a question or what information we might need, and that information might be presented to us. And so in this kind of, as we go up the ladder, the importance from which we are able to frame the question and formulate a question becomes less important. And so now, for example, we don't need to remember phone numbers as much as we did in the past. In this situation where we have perhaps a camera and a lens that's curating information and putting it in front of our eyes like a heads-up display, can put the names of people that we sometimes meet above their head, and we need to see their name, and we don't have to remember people's names anymore. And also the facial recognition knows the last time we met them and perhaps some things we have in common. And so the interpersonal skills in that situation might be diminished, or the whole process of inquiry that I talked about in the first section of asking somebody again what their name is and maybe getting some information that we may have not gotten through that simple process of inquiry of reaching out to that person and chatting with them in that situation. So now we're getting answers given to us without having to ask them. What does that mean in the process of education? Because perhaps in the budding botanist situation, you're walking through and you've already kind of asked perhaps a digital voice assistant what species of the plants are as well. And now every plant you look at is being given to you automatically, relayed on top of your heads-up display for the phone on this face. How do we automate these processes? How do we implement them in educational context? is really still a bunch of open questions in my mind, but it's definitely kind of a thing that we need to be more aware of, especially as educators, how these processes are being automated, and let our learners know, our students know, that this information is very highly curated for them, and to know and to criticize how that information is brought to them and curated for them, perhaps what algorithm put that information in front of their eyes, even perhaps without asking about it. So the whole automation process becomes more highly curated as we move towards the future, and the budding botanist needs to put the phone down and go back from the visual stimuli and visual augmentation to voice assistant to Google search, and perhaps just look around and see the weather for themselves. So there's a bunch of steps that's happening in here as we move towards the future in this whole budding botanist paradox. So the paradox of automation related to education becomes the budding botanist paradox. And so it's not necessarily that we need to pull back these automated systems. In many ways, they're helping our learners in situations where it's not critical to go through that process of inquiry. But we really need to probably bolster our digital literacy curriculum for our students, digital citizenship, for example, knowing a little bit more about the processes, the algorithms that are curating the information for them and putting this information in front of them, perhaps moving towards the future, even without being prompted or asking systems like a Google search for that information. Sometimes that's going to be because of their past behavior or the data collected about them. And other times that's going to be presented to them for other outside incentives like advertising or marketing or other systems that are pushing people, like, for example, dark patterns that we see now in software, to push them in certain situations that might benefit or keep them in walled gardens, etc., etc. And that, when that starts to blending with our realities, we need to be able to question the information that's given to us when it's curated more, even more. And that's a paradox because when it's so easy to get the answer, it becomes harder and harder to question it.